So what do a 600 million euro earthquake bureaucracy in the Netherlands, a Lego stop-motion video on social media, and a network of these underground fortresses buried deep inside solid granite in Iran all have in common?
I mean, on the surface, absolutely nothing.
Right, exactly, like zero connection. But if you look at the architecture, what's happening globally right now, they are actually all symptoms of the exact same underlying condition.
Yeah, we are basically looking at a world undergoing this cascading systemic crisis. It's a situation where the social contracts that hold our societies together are just fundamentally fraying.
Completely fraying. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. Our mission here, for you listening, is to cut through the overwhelming noise of the modern news cycle by connecting these seemingly unrelated dots.
And we're pulling from a massive stack of Dutch geopolitical commentary today. We'll be going into everything from local bureaucratic scandals to algorithmic bias, global propaganda, and the impending shockwaves of a U.S.-Iran confrontation.
It's a lot. And just a quick disclaimer before we jump in. We are covering some highly politically charged topics today.
I don't know.
We're talking about international conflicts, really sensitive migration policies, and polarizing figures, like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So we want to make it absolutely clear. Our goal here isn't to endorse anyone or take sides. We are strictly analyzing the arguments in the source material to understand the mechanics of these global shifts.
Right. It's about comprehension over outrage.
Yeah.
And to really understand the precarious position the world is in, we have to start by looking at how institutions try to maintain control when things start falling apart.
Yeah, and a perfect case study for this just came out of the Dutch parliament regarding the sabotage of the Nord Stream gas pipelines.
Ah, right. The pipelines that were blown up, cutting off Russian gas to Europe.
Yeah, which triggered those massive energy spikes.
Yeah.
Well, the revelation from our sources is that the Dutch defense minister recently admitted their military intelligence service, the MIVD, actually informed the CIA very early on about Ukrainian involvement in the Nord Stream sabotage.
Wow.
But, that intelligence was kept incredibly quiet.
Yeah, because the overarching public narrative at the time, which was heavily amplified across Western institutions, it strongly implied or even outright stated that Russia sabotaged its own pipeline.
Exactly.
And the analysts examining this, they don't just focus on who planted the explosives, they are fascinated by the strategic silence.
Because acknowledging Ukrainian involvement publicly at that specific moment, it would have made it nearly impossible to maintain the necessary public and financial support for Ukraine's war effort.
It would have shattered it. If the public finds out that the entity they are, actively sacrificing their own economic stability to support, is the same entity that blew up their critical winter energy infrastructure.
Yeah, the political will to send billions in aid just evaporates overnight.
Completely. And to understand why a government would suppress that intelligence, we really have to look at how modern states manage their populations during a crisis. There's this brilliant framework for this from the French philosopher Jacques Ellul. He wrote a lot about propaganda in the mid-20th century.
Okay, I think I remember this from the source.
Yeah.
He makes that distinction between orthodoxy and orthopraxy.
Right. Yes, exactly. It's a crucial distinction.
So orthodoxy being the traditional definition we usually think of, like having the quote-unquote correct belief, the state wanting you to genuinely intellectually agree with them deep in your soul.
Right, but Ellul argued that modern states, especially in complex crises, they don't actually rely on orthodoxy. They rely on orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy.
Yeah, orthopraxy is about having the correct action or the correct readiness to act.
Okay, so they don't care if you actually believe it.
Exactly. The state doesn't care if you've read all the geopolitical white papers and philosophically agree with a proxy war. They don't need your soul. They just need your compliance. They need to create a mental atmosphere where if they ask for a massive defense spending increase or higher taxes to fund a conflict, the public immediately agrees without questioning the underlying premise.
Okay, so it's essentially a fire drill.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like, the school administration doesn't care if the students actually believe there is a real fire. They don't care about your philosophical stance on the likelihood of combustion in the chemistry lab.
No, not at all.
They just need the muscle memory. When the bell rings, you line up, you stay quiet, and you exit the building. The action is what matters, not the inner belief.
That is exactly how orthopraxy functions. The alarm bell is a trigger for a preconditioned action. So in the context of the Ukraine war and Nord Stream, Western governments needed the public in a state of absolute orthopraxy.
They needed citizens ready to accept financial sacrifices and just narrative simplicity.
Right, a strict binary of heroes and villains.
And any nuance, like, wait, did our ally just destroy our pipeline? Or it completely disrupts the fire drill.
It stops it cold. And Alul pointed out that the greatest threat to orthopraxy isn't even a rival ideology, it's relativism.
Interesting.
It's the act of just pausing to think, to critically analyze a situation, or to ask for more context. If you pause the fire drill to ask if the alarm is just a malfunction, you ruin the drill.
Because everyone else stops to listen to you.
Right. The state views critical questioning during a crisis as a direct operational threat to its required actions.
Man, this really explains the massive institutional apparatus built to combat, quote-unquote, fake news or misinformation.
It does. But the fatal flaw in this system happens when the state suppresses a fact to maintain orthopraxy, dismisses it as a conspiracy theory, and then reality catches up.
Right. Because the truth eventually leaks out.
Always. And when the public eventually learns the intelligence was there all along, the state doesn't apologize or correct the record, because doing so admits the fire drill was manipulated.
They just move on.
Yeah, they just move on to the next thing. But you can only pull the fire alarm so many times while hiding the truth before the public just stops lining up.
And when that orthopraxy breaks down, when citizens realize the alternative facts they were told to ignore were actually true, you get a catastrophic collapse in institutional trust.
Exactly. You don't just get angry tweets. You get a fundamental breakdown in how citizens view the legitimacy of their own bureaucracy.
And we see this exact collapse happening right now, not just in geopolitics, but on the local domestic level.
Oh, entirely.
Let's look at how this manifests domestically, starting with the Groningen earthquake response in the Netherlands. For you listening who might not know, for decades, natural gas extraction in the Groningen region caused these induced earthquakes, which severely damaged thousands of homes.
It's been a massive ongoing national trauma there.
Yeah, and the government set up these institutions to assess the damage and compensate victims.
But the reality of that institutional response is just staggering. Recent figures from our sources showed that the Damage Assessment Bureau, so a bureaucratic middleman, tasked with evaluating the ruined homes, they raked in nearly 600 million euros just for their evaluations.
Wait, 600 million euros?
Yes.
Spent entirely on the administrative overhead of just looking at the damage.
Yep, rather than actually repairing homes or compensating the traumatized victims.
That is insane. It is the definition of bureaucratic profiteering.
It really is. The institutions essentially fed on the crisis. They grew larger, they employed more consultants, they enriched themselves, while the actual citizens they were created to help saw pennies on the dollar.
And when a citizen sees the state acting not as a protector, but as this entity extracting wealth from their suffering, the social contract completely disintegrates.
Exactly. If the state demands unquestioning loyalty on the global stage, but then behaves like a parasite during a domestic crisis, people stop trusting the state entirely.
And when a state loses the organic trust of its people, it can no longer govern by consensus.
Right, it has to try and govern by force, or at least by profound surveillance.
Which brings us to this whole phenomenon we're seeing across Western democracies. The reliance on big data and algorithms to enforce rules that society no longer naturally complies with.
Yes, and the perfect, disastrous example of this is the DUO scandal in the Netherlands.
Okay, let's unpack DUO. So DUO is the government agency responsible for student finance. Basically, you get more grant money if you live away from home than if you live with your parent.
Right, which makes sense on paper.
Yeah, but obviously some students try to game the system. They claim they live away to get the higher grant, but they actually just stay in their childhood bedroom.
And to catch this fraud, DUO implemented an algorithm, a predictive data model.
But this algorithm ended up overwhelmingly targeting Moroccan, Turkish, and Surinamese Dutch students.
Overwhelmingly. It resulted in massive fines and accusations of fraud against minority students. It created this huge scandal about algorithmic racism.
But the mechanics of how the algorithm became racist are what's truly fascinating to me, because it wasn't a programmer intentionally coding prejudice into the machine.
No, not at all. It was a failure to understand proxy variables and cultural nuance.
Explain that a bit more.
So algorithms need data points to assess risk. One of the variables this model heavily penalized was a student claiming to live away from home, but sharing an address with extended family.
Like an aunt or an uncle.
Right, or an older cousin. Because in a traditional nuclear family baseline, which is typical of ethnic Dutch households, moving in with an aunt might be a statistical anomaly.
Right, so the algorithm correlates it with fraud. It assumes the student is just using the aunt's address for mail while secretly sleeping at their parents' house.
Exactly. But in Moroccan, Turkish, and Surinamese communities, strong extended family living arrangements are culturally standard.
Ah. So a university student moving to a new city and living with their aunt is just entirely normal.
Completely normal. But the data model penalized that normal cultural behavior because it viewed it through the lens of a culturally homogeneous baseline. It literally flagged cultural proximity as fraudulent intent.
Wow.
And the fallout from this is a legal and administrative nightmare. The process by which these students were flagged was so fundamentally biased that DUO is now having to pay up to 2,000 euros in compensation to these individuals.
And the most absurd part is that the state has to pay this compensation, even if some of those individuals actually were committing fraud.
Yes, because the surveillance net was woven with such severe cultural blind spots that it legally invalidated the enforcement.
The state tried to use technology to substitute for lack of trust and oversight, and it ended up destroying whatever remaining trust those communities had in the government.
It's a massive backfire. And this failure of technological governance leads right into a classic political theory problem. Analysts observing this are increasingly invoking Thomas Hobbes.
Okay, taking us back to the 17th century.
Yeah, specifically his work, Leviathan. We all know the basic premise of Hobbes' human beings exist in a chaotic state of nature, so we willingly surrender a portion of our absolute freedom to a massive, powerful, sovereign authority.
Right, Leviathan.
Exactly, in exchange for security and order.
So I trade my ultimate liberty for the guarantee that I won't be murdered in my sleep.
Right. But the critical layer that analysts are applying to the modern day is that a functional, democratic Leviathan relies on a baseline of cultural homogeneity and shared reality.
Meaning you don't need total agreement on everything, but you need consensus on the basic rules of the game.
Exactly. And as a society loses that consensus, whether through the breakdown of institutional trust, the fragmentation of media realities, or cultural siloing, it fractures into subgroups that don't trust each other. And they certainly don't trust the state.
Okay, wait, I struggle to buy that completely.
How so?
Well, you're saying that just because our society is becoming more diverse or fragmented, the state is forced into becoming a surveillance monster. Doesn't that just excuse authoritarian overreach by blaming the citizens for not being homogenous enough?
Yeah, that's the tension at the heart of this analysis. The argument isn't necessarily a moral justification for authoritarianism. It's more a mechanical observation of how states behave when they lose control.
Okay.
When you can no longer govern by organic consensus, the state feels compelled to govern by ambient surveillance just to keep the fragmented pieces from tearing each other apart.
So it's an act of desperation by the state.
Yes. If you look at new proposed laws in the Netherlands laws, notably supported by the right-wing PVV party, they would give police sweeping new powers to monitor citizens online.
And what makes these specific laws a step toward that, Leviathan?
Because they allow the state to collect data and monitor citizens without any concrete, individualized suspicion of a crime.
Oh, wow. So it's just ambient.
It is preemptive, ambient surveillance. A healthy society operates on the assumption that citizens are inherently good, requiring explicit cause to investigate them. This new surveillance paradigm operates on the assumption that society is fundamentally dangerous, and everyone is a potential threat.
And citizens accept this because, as Hobbes predicted, when the world feels dangerous, people will gladly trade their privacy for the promise of security.
Safety overrides liberty. Every time.
And this isn't just academic theory, right? This desire for security is manifesting as visceral, physical fear on the streets.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally altering European politics.
Oh, it's very real.
Yeah.
The analysts highlight a very raw anecdote that captures this beautifully. It was a conversation at a gathering with several young women in their 20s.
Okay.
A hypothetical was posed to them. If a severe conflict broke out or if bombs started falling, would they run to the underground metro stations to hide, as people historically did during the Blitz?
And their response was an absolute refusal. They said they would rather take their chances above ground with military ordnance than be confined in the underground metro.
Let that sink in.
Because their fear of being assaulted or raped by gangs in those unpoliced spaces was actually greater than their fear of a bomb. Wait, they'd literally rather face a bomb.
Yes. Think about the profound implication of that calculation. It is a devastating indictment of the state's monopoly on violence.
Seriously?
If a citizen calculates that the internal decay of their society, the threat from their fellow citizens, is more lethal than an incoming military strike, the Hobbesian social contract is completely void.
The Leviathan has failed to provide the one thing it promised: physical security.
Exactly. And when the state fails to provide security, people revert to older, more primal structures. They tribalize.
Right. If the police won't protect you in the metro, you rely on your in-group.
You rely on physical readiness. The analysts specifically noted an uptick in people turning to martial arts, like Krav Maga, forming physical communities that can defend themselves.
It's basically a localized return to the state of nature.
It is. And when local governments fail to address these fears, or worse, actively cover them up, it fuels massive political blowback.
Oh, for sure.
Look at the situation in the UK. With the alleged ethnic abuse scandals in places like Rotherham, local municipalities and police were accused of suppressing evidence of massive systemic abuse by grooming gangs out of fear of appearing racist or disrupting community cohesion.
So the institutions prioritized a superficial orthopraxy of cohesion over the actual physical safety of victims.
Yes. And when the truth of those cover-ups eventually bursts into the public consciousness, the anger is volcanic.
It fuels highly disruptive, radical political movements.
Right. You see the rise of the Reform Party in the UK, or the increasingly mainstream discussions about mass deportation and retrogression in Germany. When institutional orthopraxy demands that people ignore their lived reality of insecurity, the snapback is ferocious.
Which brings us to the European Union's attempt to manage this exact explosive issue through the newly signed EU Migration Pact.
Ah, yes.
On paper, it's designed to show voters that the establishment is taking control, tightening rules, streamlining asylum, and drastically speeding up deportations for those without legal standing.
It's Brussels attempting to act as the ultimate Leviathan to restore order.
But there is a fascinating paradox here that illustrates the paralysis of the West. If this new pact is designed to be stricter and speed up deportations, why did right-wing, fundamentally anti-migration parties in the Netherlands, like the VVD and the FVD, vote against it in the European Parliament?
Yeah, it seems completely counterintuitive, doesn't it?
You would assume they'd be thrilled to have a mechanism for faster deportation.
You would, until you look at the concept of subsidiarity.
Okay, what is that?
Subsidiarity is the political principle that decisions should always be made at the most local level possible, closest to the citizen. A central authority should only step in when absolutely necessary. So these right-wing parties didn't vote against the pact because they disagree with the goal of strict migration control. They voted against it because they violently oppose the mechanism of centralization.
So by agreeing to the pact, they are essentially handing over sovereign national decision-making power to a centralized bureaucracy in Brussels.
Exactly. Even if Brussels is doing exactly what they want today, they view it as a backdoor loss of national sovereignty. They want the Dutch parliament to hold the ultimate power over the Dutch border, not a massive EU framework that might shift its political leanings tomorrow.
Okay, it's like agreeing to let a heavily armed neighborhood watch, secure your house, but having to permanently give them the only keys to your front door.
That's a perfect analogy.
You want the security, but surrendering the keys means you are no longer the master of your own house.
Exactly right. So Western nations are trapped in this paralyzing internal debate. They are fighting over cultural cohesion, tribalization, algorithmic surveillance, and who actually holds sovereign power.
And while they are entirely consumed by this internal rot, their ability to project power abroad is crumbling.
Yes.
This internal weakness is on a collision course with a geopolitical reality that the West is utterly unprepared for.
So we are shifting focus now to the international stage, specifically the agonizing standoff between the United States and Iran.
Let's do it.
Because the contrast these analysts paint between the internal mechanics of these two adversaries is incredibly stark.
Let's look at the U.S. first. The portrayal from the sources is not of a calculating strategic superpower. It is the image of a chaotic, unraveling entity.
Yeah, they point specifically to Donald Trump's current geopolitical posture. They describe his behavior as erratic firing top military generals like Randy George and William Green, which systematically dismantles institutional military memory and stability.
One analyst described his posture with King Lear vibes.
King Lear vibes, yeah.
Like a leader perhaps visibly declining, surrounded by sycophants, lashing out, and increasingly detached from the long-term consequences of his actions.
But beyond the personality, there is a fundamental destruction of American geopolitical orthopraxy happening here.
Right, because they referenced a moment where Trump essentially abandoned decades of moralizing rhetoric.
Yes.
Instead of utilizing the traditional Western justifications for intervention, like spreading democracy, liberating oppressed peoples, enacting regime change for the greater good. He supposedly reduced U.S. goals in places like Iran or Venezuela to a single, blunt, transactional phrase: take the oil.
Take the oil. When you strip away the moral justification and reduce American foreign policy to naked resource extraction, you destroy whatever remaining moral authority the United States holds on the global stage.
Because you can't build international coalitions around take the oil.
No, you can't. It projects an image of a desperate transactional empire rather than a principled global leader.
Now, contrast that chaotic unraveling with Iran. Because while the U.S. cycles through wildly different administrations and geopolitical strategies every 4 years, Iran has spent the last 2 decades operating with terrifying patience.
Terrifying patience is right. They've been preparing for one specific asymmetric confrontation.
And the centerpiece of that preparation fundamentally changes the physics of modern warfare. The analysts cite research from MIT, specifically pointing to Theodore Postal, regarding a network of subterranean complexes in Iran known as the Yazid granite fortresses.
Yes. And we need to be clear, these aren't just bunkers dug into the dirt. We are talking about an estimated 26 to 31 massive production facilities buried up to 500 meters deep inside solid granite mountains.
500 meters deep.
Yes. Let's break down the physical reality of what 500 meters of granite means against the U.S. military.
Okay.
For half a century, the ultimate trump card of the United States has been overwhelming air supremacy. The implicit threat is always the ability to bomb an adversary's infrastructure to dust.
But how do you bomb something half a kilometer deep in stone?
The physics simply do not allow it.
Really? Not even with those massive bunker busters?
No. The United States' heaviest, most advanced bunker-busting munitions, like the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, they rely on immense kinetic energy. They are these massive steel darts dropped from high altitudes, designed to burrow deep into the earth before a delayed fuse detonates the payload.
Right.
But granite is incredibly dense. The kinetic energy of even a 30,000-pound bomb dissipates rapidly upon impact with solid rock.
So just splatters, basically.
It might crater the surface, it might penetrate a few dozen meters, but it cannot reach a facility buried 500 meters deep.
Wow. It renders conventional air supremacy strategically inert.
Completely. You can fly stealth bombers over the mountain all day, but you cannot touch the factories inside.
And those aren't just hiding spots for personnel, right? They are complete subterranean manufacturing hubs.
Yes. Iran doesn't need to match the U.S. in fifth-generation fighter jets. They have stockpiled massive reserves of asymmetric weaponry, swarms of cheap, highly effective drones, speedboats for maritime harassment, and shoulder-fired anti-air missiles.
So they can launch continuous, bleeding asymmetric attacks from these impregnable bunkers, slowly draining a conventional military's resources and political will.
Exactly. So Iran has successfully neutralized the kinetic military threat. But what's truly wild is that they are simultaneously flipping the script on the propaganda war.
This ties directly back to Jacques Ellul, doesn't it?
It does. Iran is actively fighting for the psychological orthopraxy of the global audience, particularly the global south.
And they are utilizing incredibly modern viral methods to do it. They aren't relying on dry state media broadcasts. The analysts note they are utilizing platforms like TikTok, producing Lego stop-motion videos, and localized rap music.
Lego stop-motion videos to fight a superpower.
I know it sounds absurd, but the mechanics of it are brilliant.
Because the messaging is highly tailored. They use these viral formats to paint the West and American leadership specifically as immoral, decadent, hypocritical, and corrupt.
They heavily push narratives associating Western elites with moral decay, framing the U.S. as a chaotic imperialist force that only cares about stealing resources.
A narrative conveniently reinforced by statements like, take the oil.
Right. It's asymmetric warfare applied to public relations. It's like the United States brought a multi-billion-dollar radar-evading stealth bomber to a fight, but Iran brought a mountain the bomber can't scratch and a viral TikTok meme that convinces the rest of the world the pilot of the bomber is an evil clown.
That's exactly what it is. The conventional asset is useless, and the narrative battle is lost to a meme.
And when direct military victory is physically impossible, and the global propaganda war is turning against you, the conflict inevitably shifts to the one arena left, the global economy.
Which is where the massive geopolitical standoff crashes directly into the daily life of every single person listening to this deep dive.
The geographical focal point for this economic shockwave is the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow bottleneck between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, and it is the single most critical choke point for global energy transit.
A massive percentage of the world's daily oil consumption flows through that tiny strip of water.
So, if Iran, reacting to escalating pressure or an indirect strike, decides to utilize its asymmetric capabilities, those drones and speedboats, to mine or restrict traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the global economy instantly flatlines.
Instantly. And this triggers a cascading crisis that strikes at the very foundation of American financial dominance, the petrodollar system.
Let's explain the mechanics of the petrodollar really quickly, because it's basically the invisible engine of the U.S. economy.
Right. So in the 1970s, an agreement was reached where global oil transactions are overwhelmingly priced and settled in U.S. dollars. This means that if any country in the world, Japan, Germany, India, wants to buy oil to power their economy, they first have to acquire U.S. dollars.
They can't just buy it with their own currency. They have to convert it.
Correct. This creates a massive permanent global demand for the dollar. Central banks around the world have to hold massive reserves of U.S. currency.
And this artificial demand is what allows the United States to run massive deficits and carry staggering amounts of debt without suffering hyperinflation, because the rest of the world is essentially absorbing the inflation to buy oil.
But if the Strait of Hormuz is restricted, Europe is suddenly plunged into an existential energy crisis. Their economies begin shutting down.
In that desperation, the analysts argue that Europe might be forced to bypass U.S. sanctions and strike direct deals with Iran or other Middle Eastern powers to keep the oil flowing.
And here is the fatal blow. Iran, or China, acting as an intermediary, might demand that this desperate European oil trade be settled in euros or the Chinese yuan the renminbi instead of U.S. dollars.
So if Europe agrees, the petrodollar monopoly breaks.
It shatters. The massive global demand for the dollar evaporates, and all those dollars flood back into the U.S. economy, creating an inflationary shockwave that would make recent inflation look like a rounding error.
Which is exactly why the analysts argue the U.S. would never allow it to happen peacefully. The suggestion is that if Europe attempts to abandon the dollar to save its own energy grid, Washington might retaliate by threatening to entirely withdraw the U.S. security umbrella,
effectively fracturing NATO and the Western alliance over the currency used to buy energy.
It's an absolute geopolitical earthquake.
Yeah.
And if the escalation moves beyond economics and naval blockades into direct asymmetric strikes, the potential targets are terrifying.
Because neither side can hit the other's core. Washington is too far, and the granite fortresses are too deep, so they target critical, fragile infrastructure.
The analysts outline a deeply concerning vulnerability in the Middle East desalination plants.
Yes, much of the region, including U.S. allies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, are desert nations that rely almost entirely on massive reverse osmosis plants. They pull millions of gallons of salt water from the ocean and push it through high-pressure membranes to create drinkable fresh water.
These plants are technological marvels, but they're incredibly fragile, right? Massive intake pipes, delicate filtration systems, exposed power grids.
Very fragile. A single, well-placed swarm of cheap drones wouldn't just cause financial damage, it would instantly spark a catastrophic humanitarian crisis.
Because if you knock out a desalination plant, millions of people in a desert climate are suddenly without drinking water in a matter of hours.
Hours. The analysts note that Iran possesses the capability to strike these plants across the region, but has so far maintained the strategic restraint not to, fully aware of the apocalyptic consequences. But in a full systemic breakdown, that card is on the table.
And on the flip side, what is the asymmetric target for Iran hitting the West? They can't bomb our cities, but they can target the nervous system of our economy.
The analysts suggest devastating cyber attacks or even physical sabotage against the backbone of the American digital infrastructure, targeting server farms and data centers for companies like Oracle or Google.
If the cloud goes down, the modern economy literally ceases to function.
It does. And this brings us to the core warning of these analysts, the concept of a quote-unquote hot spring, a systemic crisis that finally reaches the individual consumer. And they argue we are already seeing the leading edge of this collapse.
Because it isn't just geopolitical theory. They provided some incredibly specific data points.
They did.
In parts of Eastern Europe right now, due to the instability of energy supplies resulting from the Ukraine conflict and broader supply chain fracturing, factories and businesses are already being placed on energy slots.
Right. They literally only receive electricity for 3 hours at a time before being shut off to conserve grid capacity.
You cannot run a modern manufacturing sector or a functioning economy on a 3-hour power schedule. the economic output collapses.
And it impacts the absolute base layer of human survival, food production.
Yes, the analyst pointed out that local fishermen working the North Sea are increasingly staying in port. They literally cannot afford the diesel fuel required to take their trawlers out because energy prices are so artificially inflated by geopolitical instability.
If the boats don't go out, there is no fish. If the tractors can't afford diesel to plow the fields, there are no vegetables. The logistics chain that brings food to the grocery store requires massive amounts of cheap energy.
So the analysts predict an impending severe shortage of basic food staples, entirely driven by the ripple effects of these geopolitical standoffs.
It's all connected.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
We hear doom and gloom economic predictions constantly. Every time the market dips or inflation ticks up, someone writes an article saying the sky is falling. Why is this specific scenario a systemic crisis rather than just a standard, painful economic recession that we tighten our belts and ride out for a few years?
Because of everything we discussed in the first half of this deep dive, a standard recession is a cyclical fluctuation within a system that still functions. You adjust interest rates, you endure higher unemployment for a period, but the underlying mechanisms of society, the trust in institutions, the basic social contracts remain intact.
The system bends, but it doesn't break.
Precisely. A systemic crisis occurs when the system itself is fundamentally broken before the shock even hits. We are facing this potential economic shockwave at the exact moment we lack the strong, trusted leadership required to navigate it.
We have hollowed out our own societies.
Yes, we have institutions engaged in bureaucratic profiteering while citizens suffer. We have states implementing biased algorithmic surveillance that destroys minority trust. We have populations so gripped by visceral fear that they tribalize and avoid public transport.
So when a society is that internally fractured, it has zero resilience.
Exactly. When an internally rotten structure is hit with a massive external pressure like the closing of the Strait of Hormuz or the collapse of the petrodollar, it doesn't just bend, it buckles.
The crisis isn't just that diesel is expensive. The crisis is that diesel is expensive. Nobody trusts the government to fix it. People are terrified of their neighbors, and international alliances are fracturing over currency disputes.
That is the definition of a cascading systemic collapse.
It's incredible how all these pieces fit together. We started with the concept of orthopraxy, the state demanding unquestioning compliance to a narrative like the Nord Stream sabotage and suppressing truth to maintain that action.
And we saw how that suppression inevitably leads to a collapse in institutional trust, which trickles down to domestic disasters like the Groningen earthquake response and the DUO algorithmic bias.
The Leviathan fails to protect and instead turns its surveillance apparatus on a fracturing population.
That internal decay leads to tribalization on the streets and a complete paralysis of political will, perfectly illustrated by right-wing parties rejecting EU migration laws, not because they disagree with the policy, but because they are terrified of centralized power.
Which leaves the West internally paralyzed and morally compromised, summarized by a foreign policy of take the oil, just as it collides with an adversary that has spent 20 years building impregnable granite fortresses and mastering viral asymmetric propaganda.
Leading us to the ultimate economic chokehold at the Strait of Hormuz, where the physical reality of energy transit threatens to shatter the petrodollar, driving the cost of diesel so high that a North Sea fisherman can't afford to start his boat and your local grocery shelves go empty.
It is a seamless, terrifying line from a suppressed intelligence report to a systemic global crisis.
And that is why it is so critical to look beyond the daily outrage cycle. You have to see the underlying architecture, the algorithms, the fortresses, the bureaucratic profiteering. They are all interconnected symptoms of a world running out of trust.
I want to leave you with a profound philosophical concept drawn from the very end of this commentary. The analysts were recording around Easter, and they invoked the concept of death and rebirth.
It's a powerful metaphor.
It really is. They argued that civilizations, much like nature, cannot be permanently patched. Sometimes, when a system is running entirely on the fumes of past propaganda and depleted trust, it cannot be incrementally reformed.
Superficial fixes, a new policy here, a small apology there, they are entirely insufficient for a systemic crisis.
So the question to ask yourself is this. If our current global architecture is this deeply fragile, What has to metaphorically die in our society before a functional, trust-based system can be rebuilt?
What comfortable illusions, what bureaucratic monopolies, what assumptions about global power have to completely collapse before we can start over?
It requires a ruthless evaluation of everything we take for granted.
It really does.
So the next time you see a breaking news alert demanding your immediate outrage or a politician demanding unwavering support without context, stop. Look at the mechanics.
Ask yourself what they really want.
Right. Are they trying to persuade your orthodoxy by presenting facts? Or are they just ringing the fire bell demanding your orthopraxy, hoping you'll line up without asking why? Understanding the difference is the only way to navigate a world where the system is breaking down. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.